All right, good afternoon. Let's see who's online. Got a couple of people online. Let's do a quick bit of housekeeping before we start. If you are online, just hit me up in the comments just so I know who's here. And as a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them into the chat in the chat window, or you'll see at the bottom of the screen, ask a question. A couple of people have put questions in there already. Either add a question or you can upvote for a question, upvote someone else's question, should I say, if there's something else that you're interested in. Okay, so this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are, I wanted to run through, originally this was going to be an open Q&A, but quite a few people had questions about contingency planning for obvious reasons. And a couple of people had specific questions about planning in the context of something like coronavirus, COVID-19. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit first, and then we'll get on to the Q&A. What I would say, the normal caveat applies. I'm not a doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I can't give you medical advice. The WHO has published a huge amount of information and are continually updating that. And they have all kinds of guides. I was on there yesterday. They actually have a guide for how to secure and protect your workplace, which even gets into the details of how to run a meeting. If you have to have an in-person meeting, how do you run a meeting while something like this is on? So fantastic resources there, if that is what you are looking for. And then, of course, the really important thing to be tracking right now is your local, state, and national guidance, because although there's general guidance that's been published by WHO or whomever, authorities will have to make their own arrangements and are making their own arrangements to tell you what to do. So when it comes to the planning side, and we'll talk about this in a minute, there are some best practices as far as sanitation and social distancing, etc. But then as far as what the impact on your organization is going to be, you're going to have to look at those specifics for wherever you are, because those are going to change. And they could change state by state, they could change city by city, they definitely change country by country. So please, please keep that in mind. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a few slides and go through those. And once I've worked through those, feel free to throw a question in if something comes up while I'm working through the slides, or any comments if it's not making sense or if I'm going too fast. Just let me know. I'm going to swap over here now. Okay, so as I said, I want to talk more generally about contingency planning, but I do want to focus on the challenges of contingency planning when we're faced with something as severe as the coronavirus. Let me just check I can get this. Okay, so I'm going to run through the challenges as I see it as far as coronavirus are concerned. I want to talk a little bit about contingency planning principles, and then a little bit on plan development. And then I'll touch very briefly towards assessing the plan at the end. What I don't want to do is talk for too long. I realized today that I've probably bitten off way too much to try to tackle this in one session. This is obviously a pretty huge topic, just contingency planning in general. So I want to run through the high points today, and then I think what I'm going to do is later in the week or early next week, I'm probably going to run another session where we'll maybe get into more of the detail and figure out a way to share more of the relevant information. I'd sent an email just before we started. What I've done is I've put quite a few of the planning resources. I've put links to planning resources that I've built previously. They're all in one place. The page is titled COVID-19. There's a link here. There's a link at the end, and I emailed it to you as well. So if you don't need to follow along with these now. They're not. I'm not going to be referring to these specifically, but in there you'll find things like how to develop a crisis management plan, which I'll talk about in a moment where that fits in. There are a couple of things on how to assess your plan and check your levels of readiness. So those resources are all there. So I will share these links with you afterwards, and that'll be something that you may want to go back to when you get into the detail of actually building your plan specifically. So I'm just curious if you're on right now, if you wouldn't mind jumping in the chat, just give me a sense without obviously explaining exactly who you are, organization-wise, the kind of organizations you're dealing with, because that's always helpful to sort of understand who we're chatting with. Big organization, small organization, and thank you, Lauren. Just to give a sense of the scale, I am guessing that you probably have some kind of contingency plans in place already. Possibly not for something like coronavirus, but whether it's for fire or there could be workplace violence, there could be active shooter, whatever it is. There'll be some kind of contingency plans in place. What I think is really interesting about COVID-19 is that it is such a big challenge. It's almost similar to sort of conflict, because it has such a wide impact. So it's going to be slightly different from other kinds of contingency plan. Again, the caveat, I'm not a medical professional, but from a planning perspective, from a preparedness perspective, these are some of the challenges as far as I see them. No surprise here, just the uncertainty. Every day there seems to be more data. And it appears that we're getting to the stage where, not we, but the scientists are narrowing it down to get a clearer idea of exactly what transmission looks like, what fatality looks like, etc. But there is still a lot of uncertainty. And I think part of the challenge right now is that there is so much information out there. It's hard to sift through and see what's new, what's known versus what is maybe surmised. And then on top of that, we have the normal sort of challenge of just things that just simply aren't true. So there's a lot of uncertainty still in just trying to work out exactly what we're dealing with. We have some things that seem to be working as far as social distancing and curfews and lockdowns and sanitation, but the optimum mix of those is still a little unclear. I've mentioned it in other places. I actually live in Amman, Jordan right now. We are under a strict curfew. I have not left my house for several days, and that is certainly stopping people moving around. It's very, very strict. That is working in the short term. Whether it works in the long term, I don't know. I think where we are right now, it's still uncertain how these building blocks of various measures get put together by the public health authorities to give you that optimum response. So it's going to be some kind of a mix of sanitation, and then there's going to be social distancing and quarantines, etc. Testing, specific areas where we can treat people who are sick, triage, etc. But it's trying to fit all those together, I think is where people are struggling right now. But as far as the planning is concerned, it's this uncertainty makes it very difficult to plan. It's hugely difficult to plan in uncertainty, and it's even more difficult to execute a plan at times of uncertainty. So that's probably the first thing. It is a global challenge, and as I said, it's so big. Where we have other types of significant challenge for an organization, there's often a safe haven. It could be a physical safe haven, or it might only be affecting one part of an organization. We don't really have that here. It's affecting everywhere. It's affecting everyone. It's affecting every organization. So we can't look at isolating the affected part and then carrying on with business as usual elsewhere. We can't go somewhere safer. Because it's not necessarily clear it's not clear where is safe, and so therefore we have this sort of global challenge, which again makes it difficult for planning. Pace of development, like I said earlier, there's a lot of uncertainty and things are moving fast, and when you're trying to plan in that kind of environment, often you're just reacting. It's not really planning. You're just having to react to whatever comes up next. That doesn't mean that we can't plan, but it does make it more challenging. I've talked about it's not isolated to one part of the organization. And probably the big thing for the challenges is the interdependencies and the coupling. So we've already noted that because it originated in China and because so much of the world's supply chain originates in China, now we have a huge knock-on effect just from a business. Even if it hadn't left China, it was still having a knock-on effect on businesses. Now, of course, we've switched things around. We have businesses in China going back online, it seems. Now we don't have consumers at the other end. So if you're a business sitting in the middle, Apple, say, 6 weeks ago, you had a supply chain issue coming in from China. Now you have a consumer issue because people don't want to go out and buy things. Plus you're in California and everything's shut down. So all these interdependencies do make it much more complex as far as planning. But I think there are some advantages or some things that actually help us in this circumstance. As I said earlier, there's a huge amount available as far as guidance from WHO and CDC. And I apologize for not linking there. I'll put the links in there, but I'm sure everyone has already seen them. I was looking at the WHO yesterday and I'm really impressed with the kind of things that they have there, and their e-learning platforms are very good. So there's a lot out there to help guide us. So if we want to know how to sanitize an area, there's a guide for that. If we want to know how to safely have a meeting, as I said, there's a guide for that. So we have those resources there. So that's incredibly useful. Although I started off previously by saying that one of the challenges was uncertainty, we are generating a much better understanding. That doesn't mean we're out of the woods, but at least we would hopefully very soon we will know what we're dealing with, and then we can begin to tackle it. At the moment, that uncertainty is a challenge, but I think we're sort of moving towards that. I get the sense there's some consensus around what we're dealing with and how we might tackle it. Depending where you are, there's going to be varying degrees of truth around this, but there is a significant amount of activity at all levels of government, or in most places, all levels of government. So again, we're not doing this by ourselves. You have these resources to lean upon, and the state or the local government is putting measures in place that will assist us. So we don't have to plan for everything. We have to plan for our part of it, but that's hopefully within a broader umbrella of support. And I've tackled these with that it is a collective issue. So no one's singled out. Philippe, you've noted you're a comms consultant. One of the hard things is when you are the only company that has done a thing, everyone is going to focus in on you. If you are the only industry that has done a thing, everyone is going to focus in on you. So unlike the banks in 2008, where the banks were very much part of the challenge that we're facing, this is not down to one sector, one location. So we're not having to deal with the accusations that we caused this, or this is because of our negligence. Now, those may come later if there is a consensus of how to deal with it and your organization is not following those guidelines, then you may be singled out. But for right now, it's a collective issue, so no one's being singled out. That doesn't necessarily make it better, but it takes one of the challenges away, that you are not going to be the one who's having to defend their decisions and their reputation. So this doesn't necessarily make up for all the challenges, but I think that it does offset some of them. And I just see the comment there. Yeah, I think that's going to be interesting. How purpose-driven companies can continue to be in the face of this. So I want to run through a few principles, talk about a framework, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts, and then we'll see what other questions there are. So a few things on principles, and I apologize because this may be a little bit back to front because I'm going to talk about structure in a minute, but bear with me if I've gone ahead a little bit far. But just to be clear, the contingency plan is the plan we're developing for a specific scenario. It is not an overall framework like the crisis management plan, which would sit at the top of the organization. And I'll talk about that structure, the hierarchy in a moment. But we're talking about the specifics around contingency plans, but actually a lot of these principles apply to most plans. So one of the key things is to make sure it's objectives led. If you don't have clear objectives, it's going to be very difficult to know whether you've succeeded. It's going to be very difficult to know what you're working towards. So the contingency plan has to be built around objectives. And to your point, Philippe, on purpose, if you have a clear purpose and a clear vision for your company, that's going to help you with your objectives. If your objective is to make a lot of money, it's maybe not the best objective, but it's a clear objective. And so therefore, if you understand that's your North Star and that is there for everyone to understand, that is incredibly helpful. If the plan is a series of actions without an overall purpose, it can be very difficult for people to work out exactly what they're trying to achieve. So try to make sure it's objectives led would be one of the first things. The second is to make sure there's freedom of action in there. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, things change, and so you have to allow people the leeway to do that. The second thing is that the planning team won't have all the answers. So the planning team has to allow the people that are going to execute the plan some freedom so that they can apply their best judgment. And so you don't want it to be too restrictive and too tight. So that flexibility, that freedom of action is super helpful. So the ways we can do that, we talked about being objectives-led at the top level. You can set objectives for each team, and I'll link to a video that I made earlier today about how to map objectives through the organization. I wasn't going to do it now because it takes me ages to write on the board, but if you're interested in that, it may be useful when it comes to planning. So talk about objectives, talk about effects to achieve, not a step-by-step, do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that makes it much easier to put the plan together. And again, it allows the people that are executing the freedom of action that they need to actually make the thing work. It's got to be adaptable because we don't know what's going to happen. And you want to have a plan that has enough flexibility in it that you don't have to continue to rewrite the plan. So that goes back to the benefit of being objectives and effects to achieve, stating those rather than a step-by-step actions. So it's got to be adaptable, and we'll talk about how you build that into the plan in a moment. This is very important, to be personality neutral. I'm sure you've all seen it. You have a plan, and it doesn't always make 100% sense why a role has a specific set of responsibilities until you understand that those responsibilities match the personality, the person who has that current role. Once you take that person out, the whole plan falls apart. So you've got to be personality neutral. It should be focused on positions. You may match those to the day-to-day position, or you may say that, okay, this person is the leader. We're going to bring in different people who will serve as the team leader, but it can't be Bob will do this, Jim will do that, Lauren will do that. That's not going to work because people go and leave, people get sick, people need a break. So it's got to be personality neutral, and that gives you a much more robust plan rather than something that's too specific. And silly though it might sound, you've got to make sure it's actionable. I see a lot of plans where it's a beautifully written document, but I don't know how to put it into effect. So I'm not getting the direction I need. I'm not understanding what I'm trying to achieve. I'm not understanding the freedom I have and the limitations I have. I don't understand my reporting chain. So I understand that there's a plan and we're going to get back to business as usual. I'm going to protect your people and all those great things. But what it's not telling me is how do I actually do that? So it's got to be actionable. So keep those in mind. These are not just applicable for COVID-19. These are applicable for pretty much any kind of plan that you are putting together. And the final thing is just make sure it's resourced. I don't want to go on about that too much, but you have to make sure that you have the resources in place that you need. Otherwise, it's a document and simply nothing else. So we have one communicator on the call, simple and understandable. There is a difference between a plan that you will action and something that is beautifully written sometimes. I spend a lot of my time working in environments where we're speaking in English, but English is not the first language of the people in the room, or I am having to work in another language and I'm not very good at them. And so the more simple it is, the easier it is to use in a crisis because everyone is stressed. There's a lot of pressure on you. You don't need a complicated document. You need a simple plan. The situation is complicated, so keep the plan simple. But it also then means that if you're trying to work in an international environment where there's multiple languages involved, it's easier to translate it. It's easier to for other people to use it. If it's too complex, then people aren't going to be able to use it, and people will get confused no matter what language you're in. It's just too complicated to use. So a few principles there to keep in mind when you're developing these. When we go further through this, I might just send you a link later on. I've put together a little health check, and some of the things here are reflected in that health check. So if you do have a plan and you want to review the plan, there's a little checklist you can use to say, okay, for example, is it personality neutral, or does it depend upon that particular CEO, that particular CFO, that chancellor? Again, just to make sure that although you have a plan, is it actually going to work? Just in the chat, just let me know if there's any questions on this or anything, or if I'm going too quickly. Otherwise, I will just keep moving through so we can get to Q&A at the end. So I'm going to talk a little bit about plan development now. This is a little high level, but I just want to put things into context and then talk a little bit about how you can put a plan together. I do not have a template for you today. We can maybe share that later. This is really just about how you go around developing the plan itself. So within the hierarchy, I talked before about the crisis management plan. So if you're doing crisis comms, then you're going to be very familiar with this. This is the top level of the organization. So this is where your senior leadership sit. And the crisis management plan, firstly, we're dealing with the crisis. So it's the most severe thing you're going to have to deal with. The crisis management plan is your sort of operating system that's going to sit above the other parts of the plan. And that's really mainly a decision-making and command and control plan. That's what that's for. The crisis management plan does not talk about the specifics of an event. That's where the contingency plan comes in. So the contingency plan will look at the specifics of an event. How do we deal with that event? There are different names for this. It could be a contingency plan, it could be a playbook, whatever, but these are going to be more scenario specific. So the glue or the operating system that holds it all together is the crisis management plan. Contingency plans that we're talking about today, and then sitting underneath that, processes, procedures, SOPs, toolkit, whatever you want to call it. So when you want to execute on the contingency plan, and let's say you need to do a product recall or mass notification of a student body, you have an SOP for that already. Now I can use that mass notification, whether there's a fire, there's a flood, there's a snow day, there's a coronavirus, there's an active shooter, doesn't matter what the situation is, I have that tool in my toolkit, I can pull it out and I can put it to work. And that way I have a whole toolkit to use that's there that I can then adapt for the situation. The contingency plan is what's going to help me figure out which tool I need to pull out of the box for that particular situation. So just to go through these in a bit more detail, and these slides are also designed so that people can just look at them afterwards. But the crisis management plan is the top level document. Then we're going to look at the contingency plans, which we're talking about today. So it's for a specific scenario. We'll talk about these triggers and decision points later, and the courses of action and what that means and how we use those. And then the contingency plan is being executed based on the direction from the senior leadership. So the crisis management team will come together. They will make decisions. They use the crisis management plan to help inform their processes. They then pass their decisions down to another team, usually, who develop the contingency plans or execute the contingency plans. And then that team is going to pull out from the toolkit the things that they need. And again, the idea is that you have a standard set of tools that you can haul out when something goes wrong, and your contingency plan is going to tell you which ones are most applicable, or you can decide for yourselves what's most applicable. What I would say is within all of this, there are lots of different terms used around these, but you normally find that you have these different levels. Sometimes you'll have a contingency plan, it'll be split. You'll have a contingency plan at one level of the organization and then a detailed plan underneath that. Essentially, that's the same thing. The difference is when you get the processes and procedures, they're written in advance and they're standard. It is literally a toolkit, pull out the thing you need and put it to work in those circumstances. I'm just curious, if you don't mind, just let me know within what I've described there, just let me know if the organization you're working with or part of if you already have a plan in place, CMP, and if you have any contingency plans in place. I'm just curious as to what people already have there. Not necessarily for COVID-19, it could just be more in general. All right, let's talk a little bit about contingency plan development. So before we do anything else for the contingency plans now, and this is my personal preference, this process generally works, I find, in almost every situation, is the first thing is we're trying to achieve the best understanding possible. It's very difficult to plan, remember it's scenario specific, very difficult to plan without understanding what we're dealing with. So in order to get to understanding over there on the right hand side, we have to bring two things together. The first is the knowledge, which is going to be data. So we have internal data, we have external data, and those are facts. And this is the classic, let's try to have one set of facts and data, and then we figure out what those mean, and we can bring in the opinions later, but try to separate those opinions out. So we start with facts, whether that's a transmission rate, whether it's a fatality rate, whether it is an increase in demand, a decrease in demand, that's data. So we bring in the data first of all, and then we put it into context. So then we have to say, how does this apply to us? Or ask the question, so what? So basically we're saying, we have a piece of information, so what? What does that mean? So we understand that now we are down, let's just use an example of supply chain. Let's say that freight coming into a country has been reduced by 25%. That's a data point. We can then say, how does that apply to us? What does that mean for our supply chain? If we're a shipping company, what does that mean for our volume of what does that mean for us as far as the number of clients that we have to service? So we take the knowledge, we put it into context, and that gives us understanding. And this is quite important because as the picture develops over time, you are going to have to sift out data from opinion. You are going to have to keep going back and saying, so what? Because this is highly contextual. So the same situation, if you've read any of the stuff I've written about risk, the same situation, the same threat potentially, or the same set of circumstances can have very different effects on different organizations. So I think I used in one of the training sessions the example of civil unrest. If you're a foreign company working there, the civil unrest makes it very difficult for you to work, and therefore it's a negative risk, it's a downside risk. If you're a local guarding company, it could be an opportunity for you to expand. And so same situation, but contextually means very different things for different organizations. So it's really important to put that into context. I'm guessing if, so right now, and this affects my daughter as well, her classes are suspended. They haven't got to spring break yet, but she's not expecting to go back to college for the rest of the year. If this had happened in, let's say, June, after exams were passed, the impact, so the same data, but contextually, how that would have affected a university or a school would have been very different to how it's affecting schools right now. And so again, the data itself doesn't mean as much until we put it into context. So that's one of the first things that we really need to do. I mentioned this already, so just to go back, we're trying to define what's the desired end state and the objectives. Someone had asked a question, I'll maybe come back to it later on the Q&A, but this is a long-term thing. How are we going to deal with this in the long term? The end state might be, for some organizations, to have as elegant a close as possible. Some organizations may look at this and say, there is literally no way we can survive this. What is the neatest, cleanest, most honorable way, for want of a better term, to close down our business? That may be their end state that they're working towards. Other organizations might be their end state is to deliver world-class public health care. Their end state is to be able to do that in the face of overwhelming demand. So by understanding the end state, then you can start to work through the objectives. And your point about purpose and principles, if a company is genuinely committed to doing the right thing, that's really important, because then if you put if you do actually put people before profit, maybe you'll start pouring more money into supporting people. Maybe that becomes your objective. If your objective is still to return the best return to shareholders that you can, if that's your objective, then that's going to take you off in a different direction. So it's really important to understand, firstly, what the situation is, what does it mean for you, and then define the end state and the objectives. Because without that, it's not dissimilar to getting in the car and going for a drive. You can certainly go for a drive without a destination, but if you actually want to get somewhere, you have to say, where am I trying to get to? What's my ultimate destination? This seems really silly until you get in the room when things are going sideways and you realize that nobody really understands what the end state is. Nobody really has a clear idea of what the objectives are. So everyone is working around what they think they should be doing. Without that unifying purpose, it becomes very difficult for people under stress to take you in the right direction. Potential development path. So what I'm talking about here is, how could things develop? How could the situation externally develop? So what could happen as far as, in this case, as far as transmission is concerned, as far as a cure is concerned, as far as a vaccine is concerned, what else could happen as far as government, state, and local actions? So just to get a sense of what could those look like, because again, we have to start to look at what the various paths and options are. You won't know for sure, but you can put a couple of big ideas out there to say, okay, complete shutdown, partial shutdown, limited curfew, or whatever it might be, 12 months to a vaccine, 24 months to a vaccine. You can start to put down what the development paths might look like. And before I go any further, it seems unlikely in this case, but a development path might be a very quick resolution. There could be some miraculous breakthrough and it's all over in 6 months. I don't think that's likely. I haven't seen anything to suggest that, but it's a little bit like the times when we say that not making a decision is a decision in its own right. We decide we're not going to make a decision right now. It seems negative, but we've actively decided, okay, we're going to pause. Sometimes it's worth just having there as that option to understand that that is an option. It may well not come around, but have that out there. Once you have these development paths, that's when your courses of action come in to say, okay, if we see these scenarios, what are our potential courses of action? And you maybe have 3 or 4, and these will branch off as time go on. So essentially you're saying, if we see X, we're going to do Y. That's what your courses of action are. Now, X has not appeared yet. You have not been presented with that choice yet. You're just mapping out right now what those choices might be, what those courses of action could be. And then we're going to look at decisions and trigger points. I'm going to come on to these in a minute. But triggers are when that thing has happened, we need to take action. The decision point is something you can see in advance. So a simple one would be cash flow. If we get to this level of cash flow, we will have to make a decision. And that's something you can track. And you know that when you get to that stage, you'll have to make a decision. The difference is the trigger is usually something that is pushing you towards a course of action. Decision point, also you may have an A or B decision to make. We can go left or we can go right. Once you have that, and hopefully this is making sense that we're now layering down and down and down, is for each course of action or pathway, just map out the top level response. What would that look like? What would the big actions associated with that look like? Who would the owners of that be? Who would lead on that? What resources would you need to put into that? You're not trying to write a complete detailed plan for each of these at this stage. You just want to have a sense of, okay, if we see this, what does our course of action look like? And remember, if you have that toolkit of SOPs, and let's say, again, we go to mass notification, if one of the things in there is, well, we'd have to notify everyone, you know how to do that anyway. So you don't need to write that out. You just know, yeah, we've got a process for that. Again, not COVID-19, but if there was a product recall, most organizations, particularly in pharma, have a product recall protocol. So again, they don't need to detail how to do that. They know how to do that, but they may say, okay, our decision point is if we see this frequency of illness that is associated with a product, we need to trigger the product recall. So that then becomes the decision point. The trigger is the number of illnesses. The decision point is when they hit a certain number, and they have an SOP for that, and they can start moving down that path. So hopefully you'll see now how these building blocks start to fit together. and I talked about it briefly before, allocating resources. You've got to make sure then when you look at each of these, what resources are required. Can you allocate them? I wrote an article recently, and I used the phrase, the unicorn-powered helicopter, which seems really stupid. But I've sat in a number of exercises where there's no obvious solution to the problem at hand, but everyone miraculously gets out of the conflict zone, or everyone gets healthy and goes back to work. And it's this enormous jump. And so as a joke, I started calling this the unicorn-powered helicopter appears, everyone jumps in, it takes them home, and it's all sparkles and rainbows. Part of the problem is that sometimes people have these giant leaps, these giant assumptions built into their plans. So when you're doing resource allocation, you cannot assume, for example, right now, if there is an overall shutdown, you cannot assume that you have free movement. If everyone is fighting for the same resource, you cannot assume that you will get it. So when you're doing this resource allocation and resource identification, you've got to make sure that it's realistic, because otherwise you're going to find that when you come to execute, your plan hinges upon this one, it's like the MacGuffin that they talk about in movies, this one thing that everything hinges around. And if you don't have it, your plan doesn't work. So you've got to make sure that those things are available. And that also comes down to people. The people you need, the expertise you need, that's all got to be identified right now. And then the final thing is just run through the plan, do a quick top level review. Okay, do we understand how this might develop? Have we sort of mapped out 3 or 4 main courses of action? Do we know the triggers and decision points associated with those? And then if we go down each pathway, do we have the sort of a top level plan for each one, resource allocated, and just sort of sense test the whole thing. So this is the very high level part of the plan. The next stage after that, you can start to dig down into the details. And then you'll issue it. Now the review and the issue actually bump against each other, because you have a planning team, they'll develop the plan, they'll review it, they will then issue it, and you should be asking for feedback, because you need people to come back and say, okay, we've looked at this, I understand all these parts, but I don't quite understand this. Or I've noticed that this resource you've allocated in 2 places, we only have 1. And so we can't do both. What are we going to do about that? So it's a sort of cycle of review and update. Not forever, there's a separate review cycle, but solicit feedback for the plan. Particularly at the high levels, don't just issue a plan from on high and tell everyone you will make this work, because sometimes they can't. So you may have budget authority, you may have signing authority, you may have limited resources, that somebody at the operational level just can't make it happen. And so you can't say, hey, just make this so. Ask for their feedback, and they will tell you where they can see the sticking points. Also remember, the people who are responsible for execution will have a very detailed understanding of what it's required to make a thing happen. And the biggest thing you'll see is usually around time. So in your plan, you'll say, we will do X in Y period of time. And once you issue it, people come back and say, actually, there's no way that's going to happen. It's going to take 2Y or 3Y. And then again, you can start to figure out how to address that. Let me just jump into these a little bit more to clarify them. Course of action: if this happens, we'll do Y. And it literally can look like a little map. You get to a decision point and there's a fork, and on it goes from there. And I'll put something together on a slide and share that later. So that's your course of action. The trigger is, if we see this, we do Y. Okay, so if we see this, we're going to take this course of action. That's a little bit more binary, straightforward. The decision point is where it's not clear what you're going to do. You can't explicitly say, if X happens, we do Y. It may be that if we see X, we then have to decide, what does that mean and which course will we take? So that's a decision point. So course of action, triggers, and decision points. Those are some of the tools you're going to have. I keep going back through these slides. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay. Hop in the chat. Let me know if this is making sense so far, if I'm going too fast. The important thing as well is we do have a couple of questions, but if I'm not answering your questions, or if I have not answered your question so far, please let me know, and we can go back and cover that. I see a couple of people here have some specific background, specific skills. Let me know if you want to tackle anything pertinent to what you do or pertinent to your circumstances, and I'll try and address those right now. So a couple of things after planning. Horizon scanning and monitoring, you are looking out for the triggers. You are looking out for the decision points you've identified. So because you've mapped those out, you can start looking to see what those look like. So a threshold could be X number of cases in a location, and we're going to have some kind of a curfew. That's exactly what we had here in Jordan, actually, that there was a hard number. We hit that number, certain steps are going to take place. So your horizon scanning and monitoring, you're looking for those things, and you're also looking to see how things are developing, because you will start to see that things become more finite, things become more detailed. You can start to discard certain courses of action because they're not going to happen, and maybe narrow things down. If time allows, and I would certainly try to make time in almost every circumstance, even if it's only 1 or 2 hours, test and rehearse the plan, because it's going to look great on paper, and then you'll actually try and put it into action and realize that there is a unicorn-powered helicopter in there, or you have allocated the same people in 3 places, and it's just not going to work. So test and rehearse the plan, and that lets everyone else start to get an understanding of, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to approach this? If I take a big step back right now, if we're talking about COVID-19, there are a bunch of things that people are going to be doing anyway. So the plan should not have to say, you will wash your hands, you will use sanitizer. It's going to be less about that. Those are at the SOP level. Those are just basic health SOPs now. So those should be put in place as standard. And so you should not have to wait for a contingency plan to start implementing whatever health advisories have been issued by whatever local version of the government you need to respond to, whether it's the city or the state or the national government. So as a side, you're not waiting for the contingency plan to put those things in place. So those are the immediate things you need to be putting in place. What we're talking about here is, what does that mean? What's the longer term implications for the business? Test rehearsal plans. You may not have SOPs for certain things. You'll identify, if we need to go down this path, we should have a process for, again, mass notification. Let's start moving on that. Let's develop the skills that we need. Let's get any technology or purchases that we require to make the plan work. So you may need to start to go into that as well after the plan is complete. And then the final thing is review and update. And that can be in the short term. Some courses of action are no longer relevant. You can strike those. Some of these plans sit around for years, and they have to be reviewed and updated. And my rule of thumb generally is, has the situation changed significantly? Therefore, review the assumptions you made. Has your organization changed significantly? Review the assumptions you made. Did you or someone in your sector experience this kind of event? And if so, what lessons were learned? Go in and review the plan and update it. Has any regulation changed that is pertinent? Apply that. And the final one is, if none of those other 4 things have happened, the final thing is, once a year, just go back, look at the plan, review it, and make sure that it works. Otherwise, the classic is you pull the plan out, and the first thing is the phone list is in there, and half the people have left the company. That's always a standard thing you're going to come across, that that the plan is well out of date, or it's got last decade in the update. The last time it was updated, clearly it's very out of date. So try to keep these current. If it's something like something as fluid as what we're dealing with right now, I think you're going to be reviewing these plans pretty frequently. So just a reminder that a lot of the other things in the resources page, there's quite a long article I wrote about developing a crisis management plan. It goes into the details of what goes in there. To make the contingency plan work, you need to have this level sitting on top. You need to have the people there to steer the ship. Because somebody has to, when you're presented with a decision point, somebody at the organization level will have to make the decision to go left or to go right. That's usually not an operational decision. So you have to have that level of decision making in there. It doesn't have to be big. You could have a crisis management plan for a small business, but you have to separate that from the operational decision making. So that article talks about that. There's the plan health check in there. There's a couple of interviews. One with Price Floyd, who's a good friend, who is an excellent crisis communicator, has worked in government and in industry, and he has some great insights from several years in the business. And the other is with Andy Currell, who is also a good friend of mine I used to work with, who focuses on business continuity. Because here we're really overlapping with business continuity, and I don't want to get into a discussion of which one this is. We're developing contingencies to help the business continue. A lot of that is business continuity, but some of that is then strategy and decision making. So the two will overlap. There's a couple of interviews linked in there, like I said. So that's all I wanted to cover for the slightly more instructional part. Let's jump back and see if I can get through some of the questions in the last few minutes that we've got here. If there's anybody out there, just let me know. I'm not feeling quite as lonely. And if you have any more questions, please drop them into the chat. And also makes it easier to answer the questions that we go through. So there's a couple here. So the first one is the fundamentals of effective contingency plans, which Ignatius was asking. Hopefully I've covered some of that. It's a big topic. There is a lot to this. I used to teach this to industry. It was a couple of days that we would run through all of these processes. And so I think I've only just scratched the surface of this. I do want to come back to it as time goes on and start to share more resources. So, but hopefully the fundamentals are there of effectively planning. And the idea is to have those fundamentals. You can then take the best advice that you have from local government. You can then look at the business, and I think you're associated with shipping. So you can take that and say, okay, so what are the consequences for us? How do we manage that? And then you can start to put those the contingency plans together. Okay, how can a contingency team effectively mitigate the spread of the pandemic? So at the end of the day, the guidance from WHO or the guidance from the local government is going to be what you should follow. Ideally, if possible, I would always say follow the most stringent. So if for whatever reason your local government has not published any guidelines, and there are some places where they have not, then say, okay, well, what seems to be the more reasonable, the more stringent, and that may be the WHO. So the point of that is that by implementing these measures, and these measures are being updated all the time, they're being informed by the best science that's available and the best data that's available, that is going to tell us what to do to mitigate the spread. I think from a business perspective or an organization perspective, we then have to look at our organizations and say, what is it that we do and how do we continue to do that, taking these things into account. So a big part would be teleworking. Putting people on paid leave so they can stay home, or giving people more sick time, because by giving people more sick time, they're not feeling obliged to come into work. If it's possible to put people on paid leave and keep them at home, does two things. One, it stops them moving right now. But the second thing it does is when it's time to go back to business as usual, those people are still ready. The people with the skills and knowledge can be brought immediately back in and get to work. And I think the German car makers did this in 2008, 2009. They put a whole swathe of their workforce onto reduced hours, reduced pay, I think. I could be wrong here, but they certainly kept them on the payroll. So when it was time to ramp up, those people immediately went back to work. What they didn't have to do was let everyone go, fire everyone, and then start trying to hire new people who are not skilled, and mass layoffs leave a bad taste in the mouth. So you're mitigating the effect of coronavirus, but at the same time, you're also helping to future-proof your business and make sure that when when it's time to ramp up, and that could be in the short term and or the long term, it allows you to get back to business as usual as quickly as usual. And I like this. Somebody just jumped in the chat. There's no such thing as overreacting. 100%. I think Dr. Fauci said it. Dr. Fauci from the National Institutes of Health the other day. Other people have said it. What we feel is overreacting today might seem like the bare minimum when we look back upon this. And if you've been reading the blog, you'll see I've written a couple of pieces on this. There's this overwhelming response to begin with, builds this momentum, and for anything that has this sort of exponential growth, anything we can do down here will have a much bigger effect over here. If we allow things to develop and we don't start to respond until this point, we've already got a pretty steep curve there. So again, just to go back to your question, Ignatius, I think speed is hugely important. Adopt the most stringent guidelines that you can. Be aware of those secondary consequences. So telling people not to come into work or laying people off, they will not come to your workplace, but they'll be out looking for work. So they're going to go out. So you're not actually mitigating the spread. And you're also future-proofing yourself for some other things. If you're going to communicate, be clear. We have a communicator on here, so I need to be careful because I keep straying into the communicator side of things because that's what I did for a while. But if you're going to communicate, don't put your own spin on it. Just be very, very clear and put carrots and sticks in place. That can be a good thing as well. So you can, if you're asking people to wash their hands, give them the facilities to wash their hands. If you have a large work site, this is difficult, but I've seen it on large work sites. Everyone coming in will wash their hands. Everyone coming in will use hand sanitizer. Everyone coming in may have to get changed into a different uniform. Whatever it is, if you're asking people to do things, facilitate them for that. It is an expense. It is. It adds friction to the whole process. But there's no point saying, make sure you wash your hands when you come to work and there's one sink for 100 people and it's halfway into the building. You've already brought whatever is there into the building before they get to the sink. So again, facilitate it. And you can also put sticks in place. I've worked in places where people weren't wearing PPE. And it was a huge challenge because, frankly, they would sell their PPE because the value of the PPE was actually quite significant at that time. But by not having PPE, we got into all sorts of other problems of people being injured. So we just put something in place saying that if you are not presenting yourself properly equipped and dressed for work, you cannot punch in and therefore you don't get paid. So in the short term, it was beneficial for them to sell or swap their PPE. In the long term, it was not, because after a week or so of not being paid, then there was no value in getting rid of the stuff. So you can have carrots and sticks. It's going to be very specific to your workplace, and it's going to be very specific to what you're being directed to do. But I think the key thing is follow the rules, be strict, find ways to motivate people. But as much as possible, weave these into your contingency plan for continuing with business as usual. All right, just looking at this final question. So this will be a sustained, this is the question, this will be a sustained crisis of 3 to 6 months with serious disruptions in every single aspect of the economy and personal life. Any tips around the very long-term aspect of managing the crisis? Yes, but I will take a leaf out of the book of a friend of mine. I was watching his webcast yesterday, which was, I'll stay in my lane. And I don't want to get into some other things here. As I said, this is covering everything from the macro to the micro, from organizations to individuals. I think in general terms, the sooner we accept this is real, the better. That's the first thing, both at the individual level and the organization level. I think that's key, because until we do that, we're not going to take it seriously. So we have to accept it's real, and we have to take it seriously, and then we have to start. We have to start tackling it, and that is part of managing it, and it's part of keeping ourselves busy, it's part of protecting ourselves, etc. So we have to tackle it. We can't say, well, let's start social distancing next week because I really want to go out with my friends this weekend. For some people, that's not a choice, but for some people, it still is a choice. If you look at Florida during spring break, A lot of kids down there still partying, so they weren't accepting, they weren't tackling it. And all that's doing is extending the crisis. I think there's a lot to be said for streamlining. I think that's going to help. And so if we can look at what do we absolutely need versus what do we like to have, I think if we can streamline, that's going to make life easier. So if we accept that there's going to be limitations on movement, we accept there's going to be some kind of privation around we can't get the freshest fruit every day because we can't go to the store, or even if we can go to the store, shipments aren't moving and therefore we don't have those things. If we start to accept that, I think that might help. I think I've been mulling this over, and so this might not be the best answer, but I think what we need to do is accept that we're going to have two phases. We always talk about get back to business as usual, and often we'll talk about the new normal. I don't know what the new normal looks like in the long term. I think what we're looking at now is the new normal for that 3 to 6 months, that we have a lot of restrictions on movement, that we have social distancing, that we have to accept certain things that are uncomfortable, in that people we know will essentially disappear and we won't have the opportunity to engage with them or to see them, and they'll be gone. And that's a horrible thing to say, but I think that's what we're going to have to deal with. That is the normal for now, and I don't know what ends that. It could be that there is a vaccine, it could be that there's a cure, it could be that we have built up sufficient immunity in society that we're then able to say you're a higher at-risk population, so you're immunocompromised or you're older or you have an underlying condition, and therefore we treat you differently, but other people can go back to work, they can go to the park, and kids can go to school. So I don't really know what ends this normal, but I think this normal's in place for a while. And so by accepting that this is not a short-term thing, this is not something that's going to be over by the end of March, I think that helps us adapt to it, and it helps us whether it's individuals or whether it's organizations. And I think in the long term, we just need to be ready for some significant changes. And I don't know what those are. I've been listening to some people who are much brighter and better informed than I am, and these are people who have made a lot of money by betting on the right companies, and you would think of a vested interest in certain things continuing. But the interesting thing they were pointing at, just-in-time inventory doesn't work in situations like this. So do we need to review that? In America, when you want something from Amazon, you expect it to arrive within an hour in a big city. Is that reasonable? What strains does that place on society? We will have large numbers of people who will probably die in this pandemic. That's what pandemics do. I don't know what the numbers are. I don't know what that looks like. So to me, there's the big question mark. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the next new normal looks like. I think this is our normal for right now. So we need to adapt to it, and I think that will help. And then I think we just need to be ready to make a lot of changes when we come out from when we come out of this, when we get to the other side. Again, I'm not an expert on disease or anything like that, but if you think about any previous pandemic, if you think about countries after conflict and just those enormous changes, things aren't the same as they were before. And I think that's what we're looking at. And so that doesn't make it easier because we don't know what the answer is, but I think it makes it easier to just accept, hey, things are going to be very different by December, by the new year. Things will probably be quite different. By next summer, things will be very different. And that could be, if you're working with a university, is going back into the classroom going to be the way that we deliver education? I simply don't know. But I think as far as adapting from business perspective or organization perspective, it's just starting to think, once we've got these precautions in place with these contingency plans, okay, what might this look like in the long term? And as for the personal, I think a lot of this is going to come down to self-care, care of yourself, care of your family, and just making sure physically and mentally that we're looking after ourselves, because this is going to place a lot of strain. We've been homeschooling now for 10 days. It's turning out to be a little challenging for all of us. And so luckily we have a driveway that's 80 feet long or so that we can go out and hang out in there without being in the street. And without that, I honestly don't know how we'd be coping. So I don't have any good answers for that one, unfortunately. But I think with the sustained part, it's adapting to this new normal now and then starting to think about what is going to come next. So I appreciate we've covered quite a lot. And I covered a lot at a very high level and pretty quickly. This will be available as a recording to watch again, and I will include a link. I'll send a link to everyone who's signed up for this, so you can see the slides. If I update that, I will let you know. So I'll put a couple of additional links in there. There are the resources at that resource link, the COVID-19 page on my site, which go into a lot more detail on crisis management planning. And what that looks like, and as time goes on, I'll try to put together some additional resources to help people build these plans in detail. Feel free to drop me a line afterwards with more questions. There's at least one, if not two more sessions associated with this that I'll run in the next week or so, and I will make sure that everyone knows when those are coming, so you can jump in. As always, please let me know if this is answering your questions. If not, ask the question again, say what I missed, maybe be more specific, or tell me specifically what I have missed, and I will try to answer. That's the purpose of this, to try to share knowledge with as many people as possible. As I said, I'm not an expert in pandemics. I'm not an expert in any of this, but I'm trying to have the expertise that I have, or the experience I have, planning and responding to more challenging circumstances. I'm trying to share that and do my part to help people right now. So I appreciate people taking the time to tune in. I appreciate the questions from everyone that submitted questions, and I look forward to seeing you on one of these again soon. Take care. Bye now.